You need to come with us.
I understand, officer.
Get out of the car. Don't argue. We know what you're up to. Yesterday, he was dragged away in handcuffs like a criminal. Today, those same cops walk into court, and he's the judge deciding their fate. The highway shimmered under the late afternoon sun, asphalt breathing heat like a restless animal. Travelers moved in and out of a rest stop, families with children tugging on soda bottles. Truckers, stretching legs stiffened from miles of solitude. Strangers brushing past each other with the fragile courtesy of the road. To most, it was an unremarkable pause in the middle of nowhere. But to one man sitting quietly on a wooden bench, it was the thin line between calm and chaos, silence and storm. His name was David Mitchell, a tall black man in his mid-40s, sharply dressed even in travel, pressed slacks, a light blue shirt with sleeves rolled back to his elbows, and wire-frame glasses catching the sunlight. He carried himself with the composure of someone used to being underestimated, but never undone. He was on his way home from visiting his elderly mother 2 towns over, the trunk of his car filled with groceries she insisted he take. He had no idea that within minutes, strangers would rewrite him into a story of accusation and humiliation. 2 patrol cars pulled in with screeching brakes, shattering the ordinary hum of the stop. The officers stepped out, uniforms sharp, voices sharp, eyes sharper still. Their movements were too focused, too eager. They weren't responding to chaos. They were bringing it. "Sir, step away from the bench," one of them barked, his tone more verdict than request. David blinked, confused. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was calm, measured, the kind of calm that only comes from years of practice. But calm didn't matter. They moved in on him with questions already steeped in accusation. Suspicious vehicle, possible theft, possible drug transport. Words hurled like stones, vague enough to be true of anyone but pointed enough to stick to him. The families at the rest stop fell into a hush, eyes darting toward the unfolding scene, then quickly away. Some pulled out phones, too timid to interfere, but unwilling to look away. David stood frozen, heart pounding but posture steady. He had been here before, not this exact place, not these inbred men, but this posture of suspicion, this theater of control. They demanded ID. He gave it. They searched his car without cause, tossing aside grocery bags like they were trash. They cuffed him in broad daylight, the metallic click ringing louder than any child's laugh, louder than the birds overhead, louder than his own pulse in his ears. A man with no record, no wrongdoing. A man whose greatest crime at that moment was simply existing in skin too dark for their comfort. "Suspicious black male, possible resisting," the radio crackled as they shoved him toward the car. His glasses slipped down his face. He didn't resist. Not once. He only stared at the asphalt, memorizing its cracks as if to anchor himself to something steady. To the world, it looked like another arrest. To David, it was another scar, public, humiliating, and stitched into his memory with the threat of injustice. But what no one there knew, not the families watching, not the officers who cuffed him, not even David in that very moment, was that this arrest would not end at a jail cell. By tomorrow, in the same daylight, those very officers would walk into a courtroom, and the man they thought they had reduced to nothing but another statistic would be sitting high above them in the robe and bench of justice. Judge David Mitchell. Because fate doesn't forget, and neither does justice. The next morning dawned with a brightness almost cruel in its indifference. Sunlight spilled across the small suburban neighborhood where David lived, painting over the bitterness of yesterday with the same golden brush that touched every lawn, every mailbox, every window. His home was modest but dignified, a 2-story house with white shutters and a porch swing that had carried the weight of many quiet evenings. David stood at his kitchen counter, pouring coffee into a mug his mother had given him years ago. On its chipped ceramic surface, fading letters spelled out, "Justice is not a privilege, it's a right." He smiled faintly at it, though his eyes were tired. Sleep had come in fragments, broken by the echo of cuffs snapping around his wrists, the smell of hot asphalt pressed against his cheek when they shoved him against the hood. He had replayed the scene too many times, not in anger, He was long past rage, but in disbelief at how quickly dignity could be stolen in broad daylight. But this morning, he straightened his tie, buttoned his dark suit, and polished his shoes until they gleamed. Because David Mitchell wasn't just another man wronged by circumstance. He was a judge, a man who carried the weight of the law, not just as a profession, but as a calling. Few knew how hard he had fought to stand where he stood now. Born in a small town where doors often closed quietly when his family walked down the street, David had grown up on stories of his grandfather, an Army veteran denied a GI Bill loan, forced instead to build their home with his own calloused hands. His father, a teacher, had drilled into him a simple mantra: excellence is the loudest protest. David had lived by it, top of his class in law school, years as a defense attorney fighting for clients who could barely afford him, a career marked not by ambition, but by a stubborn insistence that the law should serve the people most harmed by it. When the governor appointed him to the bench 3 years ago, he had walked into that chamber not with pride, but with gravity. He knew what it meant to be a black man wearing a robe in a courtroom where too many men who looked like him had been shackled instead. This morning, as he tightened his tie in the mirror, he didn't yet know who would walk into his courtroom. He only knew that the day's docket would test his patience and sharpen his resolve, like so many others had. Across town, in a precinct office that smelled of stale coffee and paperwork, 2 officers sat nervously at their desks: Sergeant Cole Harper and Officer Brian Lane. Their arrest from the previous evening had drawn attention, not the kind they wanted. Someone at the rest sheet had filmed it. The video was spreading online, clipped and captioned, "Innocent man arrested for sitting while black." Their captain had called them in, tight-lipped, his jaw working as he told them to prepare for an internal affairs review. Cole, the older of the two, tried to mask his unease with bravado. It was standard procedure. Guy was acting suspicious. Brian shifted in his chair. He was younger, less certain, his face pale in the fluorescent light. Suspicious of what, Cole? He was just sitting there. His voice carried the tremor of someone who had seen the line crossed but hadn't found the courage to step back from it. Cole didn't answer. He didn't have to. Both knew the truth. What had been done yesterday wasn't about procedure. It was about prejudice sharpened into instinct. And now, for the first time, their badges weren't shields. They were weights, dragging them toward consequences they had never imagined. By mid-morning, David drove downtown, the city unfolding in bright rhythm, commuters rushing, children chasing each other across schoolyards, life continuing as if justice were not on trial every day. He parked beneath the courthouse, walked the marble steps with steady composure, and entered the building where sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that floated like tiny suspended truths. Clerks greeted him with respectful nods. Attorneys carried stacks of files past him, their voices low, urgent, rehearsing arguments. He moved through it all like a quiet center, his robe draped over one arm, the chipped mug in the other hand. He reached his chambers, set down the mug, and slid into the black robe that transformed him from man to institution. It was heavy, symbolic, almost sacred. "Your Honor," a clerk said softly, handing him the morning docket. His eyes scanned the list. Routine cases, hearings. Then he saw it. Internal affairs, allegations of unlawful arrest, names, Harper, Lane. David froze, the paper suddenly heavier in his hand. The letters blurred, but the memory was sharp. Their faces, their voices, the humiliation of yesterday. The men who had cuffed him like a criminal were about to walk into his courtroom. He closed the docket, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, "Excellence is the loudest protest." And then he stood, ready to preside. The courtroom was bright that morning, sunlight spilling through tall windows and laying gold across the polished wood of the benches. To most, it was just another day of proceedings. But to the officers being escorted inside, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Cole Harper strode in first, jaw clenched, shoulders squared. He carried himself like a man determined to project confidence, though his eyes betrayed flickers of unease. Behind him, Brian Lane walked more slowly, the stiffness in his posture less about pride and more about fear. Reporters had gathered near the back, pens and cameras poised. The air buzzed with a tension so taut it could snap at any moment. When the bailiff called, "All rise," every head turned toward the chamber door, and then David Mitchell entered, the robe draped over his tall frame, commanding but not theatrical. He moved with the calm gravity of someone who knew the power of silence. The room shifted, an unspoken recognition in some eyes, confusion in others, an outright shock in two faces that turned pale in an instant. Cole's mouth opened slightly, his bravado crumbling as realization dawned. Brian's lips parted, his eyes darting from David to the floor, then back again, like a child caught stealing. They knew. Everyone in that room would soon know. David settled into his chair behind the bench. His gaze swept the courtroom, but lingered only a second longer on the two men before him. He did not smirk. He did not gloat. His face was unreadable, carved into the mask of justice. Only his eyes carried weight, the steady, unblinking eyes of a man who had been humiliated, but would not humiliate in return. "This hearing," he began, his voice resonant yet calm, "concerns allegations of misconduct during an arrest conducted on June 14th. Officers Harper and Lane, you stand accused of unlawful detainment, violation of civil rights, and abuse of authority. You will have the opportunity to present your account. The court expects truth, nothing less." His words hung in the air, measured and precise. To anyone else, it was a standard opening. But to Cole and Brian, it was a blade, reminding them that yesterday's victim now sat as today's judge. The prosecution began, laying out the complaint. Video evidence was introduced, the same clip that had already spread online. On the screen, in broad daylight, the arrest unfolded. David sitting quietly, answering calmly, complying fully, yet cuffed, searched, and shoved like a criminal. Gasps rippled through the audience as the footage played, though David's eyes never left the screen. The prosecutor's voice cut through the silence. "Your Honor, this is a textbook example of racial profiling. No probable cause, no crime, only bias weaponized under the color of law." Cole shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. When the time came for his defense, he stood, clearing his throat. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we acted on a call. We received a report of a suspicious vehicle. Man sitting alone, matching the description. We did what procedure demands." His words rang hollow. Even Brian glanced sideways at him, doubt flickering across his features. David leaned forward slightly, his voice even. "Officer Harper, can you specify what about this man was suspicious?" Cole faltered, the courtroom silent. He was sitting there for a long time. We thought maybe he was waiting for a contact. Could have been a drug exchange. These things..." David's gaze did not waver. "And did you find drugs?" Cole hesitated. "No, sir." "Did you find stolen property? Weapons?" "No." David's tone remained calm, but every word cut. "So, to clarify, your suspicion was based solely on a man sitting at a rest stop bench. Is that correct?" Cole swallowed hard. "We have to make judgment calls in the field, split-second decisions." Brian shifted again, sweat forming at his temple. He could feel the weight of truth pressing against the hollow excuses. When David's eyes turned to him, he nearly flinched. "Officer Lane," David said softly, "do you agree with your partner's account?" The room went still. Brian's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. We didn't have real cause, sir. We acted too fast." He lowered his gaze, shame burning on his face. "It wasn't right." A murmur rippled across the courtroom. Cole shot him a look sharp enough to cut, but Brian didn't meet it. His conscience had broken free. David leaned back, his hands folded. He studied the young officer, seeing in him not just guilt, but possibility, the fragile beginnings of acknowledgement. And in that moment, the balance of the room shifted. This wasn't just about what had been done. It was about what would be revealed, who would be changed, and whether justice could be more than punishment. The hearing pressed on. Witnesses were called. A mother who had been at the rest stop testified how her child asked why the man was being arrested, and she hadn't known what to answer. A trucker confirmed there had been no disturbance, no suspicious behavior, only officers who seemed determined to find trouble where there was none. Each testimony stacked higher against the two men until their defenses looked flimsy, like paper shields against a rising tide. But the real storm had not yet broken. That would come when David decided it was time to speak not just as judge, but as the man they had tried to reduce to nothing. Cole's jaw was tight as steel, his hands gripping the table so firmly the veins rose along his knuckles. The testimony of bystanders had chipped at his defenses, but his pride refused to crumble. When given the chance to speak again, he pushed back with a voice too sharp, too practiced. Your Honor, with all due respect, it's easy to judge from a distance. On the ground, in real time, things aren't so clear. We're trained to act fast. We don't get the luxury of hindsight. David tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. So you believe your actions were justified? Cole straightened. Yes, sir. We kept the public safe. If we second-guess every instinct, people could get hurt. A hush fell across the courtroom. Even those who might have once sympathized with the difficulty of police work shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone could see what the video had shown. There had been no threat, no crime, only a man sitting quietly until suspicion turned him into prey. Brian's shoulders slumped. He couldn't take it anymore. That's not true, he said, his voice breaking through the silence like a crack of thunder. All eyes snapped to him. Cole's head whipped around. What the hell are you doing? He hissed under his breath. Brian stood, his hands trembling. I can't lie anymore. We had no reason. None. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't breaking any law. He was just... His throat tightened, shame swelling in his chest. He was just living, and we treated him like a criminal. The gallery stirred, whispers rippling. Reporters' pens scribbled furiously. The young officer's confession was more damning than any evidence. Cole slammed his fist on the table. Shut your mouth, Lane. You're throwing both of us under the bus. But Brian didn't sit. His voice grew stronger, steadier. No, Cole. I'm telling the truth. I joined the force to protect people, not to humiliate them. Yesterday, we failed. I failed. His gaze lifted, and for the first time, he looked David squarely in the eye. I'm sorry, sir, for what we did to you. The courtroom froze, every ear strained for David's response, but he remained still, his hands folded, his face calm. Inside, his chest tightened, not from triumph, but from the weight of the moment. A confession, an apology, and from the younger man, not the older. Cole's face burned red with fury. He turned back to David, spitting his words like venom. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. He's buckling under pressure. We did our job. That's it. You think you can sit there in your robe and... He stopped short, the unspoken words hanging in the air. And what? Pretend you weren't the man we cuffed yesterday? Everyone in the room felt it, the truth teetering on the edge of exposure. David leaned forward, his voice low but powerful. Officer Harper, choose your next words carefully. Cole's breath hitched. For the first time, the mask of control cracked. He looked away, his bravado shrinking in the face of David's steady gaze. The prosecutor rose, sensing the shift. Your Honor, at this point, the facts are indisputable. One officer admits misconduct. The video corroborates. Witnesses corroborate. The only denial comes from a partner unwilling to confront his own prejudice. We request that both men be held accountable. The gallery stirred again, louder now, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters leaned forward, sensing history being written. The very officers who had once strutted with unchecked power now sat cornered, stripped of their shield of authority. And still David did not strike. He let silence hang, deliberate and heavy. He wanted them, and everyone watching, to feel it, to understand that justice wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth, and truth was pressing in from every side, leaving no room for escape. Finally, he spoke. This court will recess for 15 minutes. When we return, we will hear closing arguments, and then... His gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Cole, then Brian. This court will decide. The gavel struck. The sound cracked like lightning. The officers were led to the side, one with fury boiling in his veins, the other shaking with the relief of confession. The gallery buzzed with restless energy. voices low but urgent, the weight of the climax yet to come. David rose slowly, retreating to his chambers. Alone, he exhaled deeply, pressing his hands against the desk. For a moment, he allowed himself the vulnerability he had denied in the courtroom. His reflection stared back at him in the glass pane of his office window, the same man who had been shoved, cuffed, and dismissed as nothing. And now, fate had placed the scales in his hands. The world was watching. The decision would not just shape the lives of two officers, it would echo far beyond the courtroom, into the homes and hearts of everyone who had ever wondered if justice was real. The storm was about to break. The courtroom filled again, the air charged like the stillness before a storm. Every seat was taken now. Word had spread through the courthouse of the extraordinary case unfolding within these four walls. The hum of whispers fell silent when the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." David entered, robe flowing, face calm but carved with gravity. The room stood as though compelled not by custom, but by the weight of what they were about to witness. He took his seat, the gavel resting in his hand like a symbol of balance waiting to fall. "Court is back in session," he said evenly. His eyes flickered once to Cole Harper, who sat rigid, jaw tight, and then to Brian Lane, whose shoulders slumped under the burden of truth. The prosecutor rose first. "Your Honor, the case speaks for itself. An innocent man was humiliated without cause. Video evidence, multiple witnesses, and Officer Lane's own testimony confirmed the abuse of power. The public entrusts these officers with authority to protect, not to persecute. We request disciplinary action at the highest level." The defense attorney, hired hastily the night before, stumbled through arguments about reasonable suspicion, split-second judgment, and uncertain circumstances. But the words rang thin in the shadow of the footage, the testimonies, and the confession. Then David spoke, his voice soft but commanding. "Before this court deliberates, I want to hear directly from the defendants." Cole pushed to his feet, his chest puffed out, though his eyes betrayed unease. "Your Honor, I stand by what I did. I've served this community for 20 years. I've put my life on the line more times than I can count. Maybe we made a call that looks bad now, but in the moment, it felt right. We don't get to sit around analyzing. We act. That's the job." His words trembled with desperation dressed as pride. David's gaze bore into him. "And what part of your job includes treating a compliant citizen as though his very existence is a crime?" Cole's mouth opened, closed. Silence. The courtroom leaned in, breathless. Then Brian stood. His voice was quiet but clear. "Your Honor, I can't defend what we did. We didn't protect anyone. We only hurt someone who deserved none of it." He glanced at Cole, then back at David. "I'm ashamed. And I'm sorry. Not just to you, sir, but to every person who has ever felt that fear, that humiliation for no reason other than who they are." Gasps rippled through the room. A raw honesty hung in the air, fragile but undeniable. David let the silence breathe, his fingers tapping lightly against the bench. Then he rose to his feet. The shift in posture commanded the room's full attention, the robe dark against the flood of sunlight streaming through the high windows. "I will now render judgment," he said, his voice carrying like a drumbeat through the chamber. He looked first at Cole, his tone sharp but controlled. "Sergeant Harper, you claim years of service. Yet you cannot see that authority is not a license to indulge bias. Power without accountability becomes tyranny. Yesterday, you used your badge not to protect, but to project suspicion onto an innocent man. You abused the trust of your community, and you dishonored the oath you swore." Cole flinched, sweat glistening at his temple. Then David turned to Brian. His tone softened, though the weight remained. "Officer Lane, you are guilty of the same misconduct. But today, you chose honesty over denial. That choice does not erase the harm you caused, but it does open the door to change. The law cannot reward confession with absolution, but it can recognize courage when it appears." The room was utterly still. Reporters' pens scratched furiously, capturing history. David's voice grew stronger, each word deliberate, steady as stone. "I was the man you arrested yesterday." A collective gasp erupted. Even those who had suspected it felt the revelation crash over them like thunder. Cole's face went white, his lips parting soundlessly. Brian's eyes dropped, shame flooding deeper into him. Yes, David continued, his voice resonant. I was the man sitting quietly at a rest stop. I complied, I cooperated, I posed no threat. Yet you cuffed me, you searched me, you humiliated me before strangers, before children, for nothing but the color of my skin. And today, by the providence of fate, I sit here as your judge. The gallery stirred with emotion, anger, sorrow, awe. David's gaze swept across them before returning to the defendants. I could let vengeance speak today. I could let anger dictate this ruling. But justice, true justice, demands more. It demands accountability, not cruelty. It demands transformation, not retribution. He raised the gavel slightly. Therefore, this court finds both defendants guilty of misconduct and violation of civil rights. Sergeant Harper, you are hereby suspended pending further disciplinary review with recommendation for termination. Officer Lane, you are suspended as well, but the court strongly recommends enrollment in comprehensive bias training and community service under civilian oversight. The path you choose beyond that will define the kind of officer you become. The gavel came down. Crack. The sound reverberated through the chamber like a lightning strike, final and irreversible. Cole's face twisted in rage, his mouth opening to protest, but the bailiff's hand on his shoulder silenced him. Brian bowed his head, tears streaking silently down his cheeks. The room erupted, some in applause, some in stunned silence, all caught in the gravity of what had just unfolded. David remained standing, his expression steady, his chest rising with the slow exhale of a man who had carried the weight of humiliation and now released it not in vengeance, but in justice. The storm had broken, and in its wake stood truth undeniable and radiant in the daylight. The gavel's echo faded, but its weight lingered in every heart present. For a moment, the courtroom was suspended in silence, as though the world itself was absorbing what had just transpired. Then, like a wave breaking, the reactions came. Murmurs swelling into applause, others rising to their feet in awe, some simply weeping quietly where they sat. The bailiff restored order, but the energy could not be contained. This was more than a ruling. It was revelation. A man humiliated yesterday had stood in judgment today. A wrong had not just been punished, it had been transformed into a testament. Cole Harper sat stiff, fury burning in his face. His fists were clenched, knuckles white, but his eyes darted toward the reporters, toward the phones raised in the gallery, capturing his downfall in real time. He had spent 20 years wielding the badge like armor, certain it would protect him from consequence. Now, under the unflinching sunlight of truth, it looked flimsy, rusted, and small. Beside him, Brian Lane sat with his head bowed. His shoulders shook, not from rage, but from something deeper. Remorse mingled with relief. The lie he had carried for only a day had felt heavy as a lifetime. Now it was gone, stripped away by confession, but the shame remained. Yet shame, unlike denial, held the possibility of change. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps the moment the session adjourned. Microphones thrust forward, questions fired like arrows. Judge Mitchell, what was it like to rule on your own arrest? Your Honor, is this the beginning of broader accountability in policing? Do you believe justice was served today? David walked steadily down the steps, robe removed now, his dark suit once again crisp in the morning sun. He paused, the crowd pressing in. Cameras flashed. Children craned to see the man whose story was already racing across screens and headlines. He raised a hand, not to silence, but to steady. His voice carried with calm authority. Yesterday I was treated as less than a man. Today I had the privilege to respond not with anger, but with justice. Let me be clear, this is not about me. This is about every person who has ever been reduced to a suspicion, a statistic, or a stereotype. Justice cannot erase what was done, but it can demand accountability. And accountability, he glanced back toward the courthouse doors, is the first step toward change. The crowd erupted in applause. His words, carried on the wind, settled not only on those steps, but into the wider conversation of a nation always wrestling with justice and race, power, and prejudice. Inside, Cole was escorted out through a side door, his face set in the stone. He muttered under his breath, words no one needed to hear to understand. He would not change easily. His pride was a fortress built over decades, its cracks now visible but not yet shattered. He would fight, appeal, rage. But the verdict stood, and the world had seen him stripped of his shield. Brian, however, lingered in the hallway. He stood alone, leaning against the cool marble wall, his badge heavy in his pocket. When David passed by later, their eyes met for a brief moment. Brian swallowed hard, words forming but dying on his lips. All he could manage was a quiet, broken, "Thank you." David stopped, studied him for a moment, and replied simply, "Don't thank me. Do better." Then he walked on, leaving Brian staring after him, those two words echoing louder than any sentence a court could impose. Days turned into weeks. The video continued to spread, no longer just evidence in a courtroom, but a symbol, a story replayed in newsrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across the country. Commentators argued, activists marched, police departments debated. But beneath all the noise, one image remained. A black man in a judge's robe, staring level into the eyes of the officers who had once cuffed him. For David, life resumed its rhythm, though it could never be the same. Each morning he still tied his tie, polished his shoes, carried the chipped mug from his mother's kitchen. But when he walked into the courthouse now, clerks, attorneys, even strangers looked at him differently. Not just as a judge, but as a symbol of something larger. Some with admiration, some with discomfort, but all with awareness. At night, he often sat on his porch swing, the cicadas buzzing in the summer air. He thought of his father's words, "Excellence is the loudest protest." He thought of his mother, still alive but frail, who had once warned him that no matter how high he rose, some would still see only the color of his skin. He thought of the little boy at the rest stop, asking his mother why the man in glasses was being arrested, and the silence that followed. Perhaps, David hoped, that boy had seen the news. Perhaps he now knew that the man in cuffs was also a man in robes. That dignity can be stolen for a moment, but not forever. As for Brian, his journey had only begun. He accepted the suspension, entered the training programs, and spent weekends volunteering at community centers where young men looked at him with skepticism. At first he stumbled, but gradually he learned to listen, to hear stories that mirrored the one he had helped cause. The shame didn't leave, it grew into something else, a resolve. Redemption is not a moment, it is a path, and he had started walking it. Cole, meanwhile, fought bitterly against his suspension. Appeals, interviews, rants about witch hunts, and political games. But the tide had shifted. Where once he was shielded by silence, now the world had seen. His words rang hollow outside the echo chamber of his own pride. The story of Judge David Mitchell entered textbooks, podcasts, sermons. Not because it was unprecedented, countless injustices had occurred without such poetic reversal, but because it crystallized something rare. The collision of humiliation and authority, prejudice and justice, all within the same man. And David himself? He carried it quietly, never gloating, never basking. When asked years later about that day, he always answered the same. It wasn't about me. It was about what we choose to do when power shifts hands. I chose justice. On a quiet Sunday morning, walking out of church with his mother, a young boy approached shyly, tugging on his sleeve. "Sir," the boy whispered, "are you the judge from the news?" David crouched down, smiling gently. "Yes, that's me." The boy's eyes were wide. "My mom said you showed them we can't be treated like that we matter." David's throat tightened. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You do matter. Always remember that, and one day it'll be you teaching the world the same thing." The boy grinned, his small chest puffing with pride, and ran back to his mother. David stood slowly, the sunlight warm on his face. For all the pain, for all the scars left behind, this was why it mattered. Not for vengeance, not even for vindication, but for the future, bright, fragile, unformed, carried in the hearts of those who watched, who learned, who believed. And so the story ended not with a gavel, not with a headline, but with a question. One David often carried with him into the quiet hours. What if every person who tasted injustice could one day sit in the seat of power, not to repay pain with pain, but to turn it into something greater? What kind of world would we build then? The cicadas hummed, the sun blazed, and the porch swing creaked gently beneath him. Justice had spoken, but the work remained, and in the daylight he was ready.